listening to On the Way Home with your host, Michael Braithwaite.
Welcome, friends, to another episode of On the Way Home. I'm your host, Michael Braithwaite, and I work with an incredible group of about 130 people at Blue Door. Blue Door helps people along their housing journey, their health journey, and their employment journeys on a better path forward in York, Durham, and Peel region. Incredible life-saving work with a lot of our frontline heroes. Check out the work we do at bluedoor.ca. Hey, if you have an idea for a guest, maybe it's you, maybe it's someone you know, maybe it's something you're interested in, reach out to me at michael.b@bluedoor.ca. Or if you have any comments or thoughts about the show, we'd love to hear them. Again, michael.b@bluedoor.ca. We'd love to hear from you. We have two great guests today on the show. But often we look at problems and maybe they or these challenges we have, and we're like, man, they just almost seem too big. But on this podcast, very often we have people that don't shy away from the big, complex challenges. They dive right in. Jeanhy, Shim, and Mukhtar, Latif are two of those people, right? These are two brilliant people that have been in the sector a long time, come from different walks of life, right? And Mukhtar's had 30 years of international affordable housing experience, and Jeanhy's just a kind of entrepreneur and change maker. He's really passionate about city building. They kind of brought these ideas together. One of the big challenges we have in this sector is really like, how do we actually make development, affordable housing development happen? Often it's issues around capital, kind of bringing people together to different partners to raise the money to do the work we need to do. So Mukhtar and Jeanhy have come up with Crosswalk Communities. They built this, and it's a really cool organization wanting to do great work, bringing in private investors, and really is an innovative way at looking at how we raise capital to get affordable housing built and much, much more. We have a great conversation about how it all came about, what exactly Crosswalk Communities does, and their hopes for the future. I hope you enjoyed the conversation and learned as much as I did. Let's go to that conversation now. Jeanhy and Mukhtar, so happy to have you on the pod today. Thanks so much for making the time.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thank you, Michael.
And Mukhtar, I think are you on the West Coast as we record this? Or are you?
I'm actually in the UK today.
Oh, see, that is dedication, friends. So it is it's 7:00 at night right now, or
it is 7:00. Yeah,
7:00 at night. Well, thank you for making the time from the UK to do this. This truly is an international podcast too. We've had guests from the UK and even Australia, where it's been really tough to time, but they've been flexible with us. We ask every guest the same question because it's a very personal question. And that is, what does home mean to you? Jeanhy, we'll start with you.
What does home mean? Home is a place of comfort, of refuge, a place to rejuvenate, a place where you feel comfortable, where you can relax. And it gives you a sense, I think, of belonging and connection to the community. I know it's like a physical connection, but it's kind of the place where you're anchored into the community. I remember when my parents first separated and the house was sold, and my dad, he had a really hard time transitioning and just not having a house key because he wasn't sure where he wanted to live. But it was interesting, just that feeling so disconnected from everything because he didn't have his house keys. And so definitely I think home is so important for so many reasons. I mean, there's the practical reasons, but I think psychologically, and I know for me, it's a place you can go home, you just relax, like I said, rejuvenate, and you feel safe. So that I think is what home means to me.
Very nice. Mukhtar.
Yeah, I mean, I think I could relate to the feeling of a home from a whole range of different experiences that I've had. On a personal level, it's something where you can feel safe and secure. But I've seen the impact it's had on other people when we've been building affordable housing, and you have people go into them as families, and it provides them a platform to then build the rest of their lives. And that's been something that's been really key for my development as well, in terms of a place where you can feel safe, secure, and you got then the energy to think about the future because you got the basic need met in terms of shelter. And that's another personal hit there is where my dad he migrated from Kashmir in Pakistan to the UK back in the late 50s. So he was one of the first ones to buy a home. And when we had relatives and friends coming over at that time. There's a lot of migration. They were living in the house, and again, it was a platform for them to come to a place, feel secure, be able to save, and then be able to move on with their lives. And that's been pretty important in terms of my fundamental understanding for affordability and housing. And then there's been other examples where we built the first movable modular housing project in Vancouver, and we moved people in from the SROs, which are the single room occupancy hotels that were built at early 1900s. And they moved into the home, and they were so happy because they felt dignity, because they had their own personal space, that they could feel dignified. They had shared bathrooms, awful things happening in those SROs. So there's been lots of different aspects that have sort of given me a feeling of home, which has allowed me to think about those that don't have a home. And that's a key motivator from my side in terms of addressing those needs. And then just another basic thing, when I was at the City of Vancouver, we used to do the homeless count. I used to do the 6 o'clock, 8 o'clock in the morning shift, so then you can get on with the rest of the day back in the office. So, and you're getting up at 5 o'clock in the morning, you're having your shower, and then you're thinking, how blessed are you? So there's a feeling of gratitude that you're fortunate enough to actually have a home. Because when you go out on the street and people are having to wake up on the street and nowhere to go, and you just basic necessities, you just don't realize how fortunate we all are that those that can have a home to live in.
Yeah, I mean, just to add to that, if I can, Michael, I mean, a home is people who don't have a home or have precarious a home situation, shelter situation. You know how much energy that takes? And to Mukhtar's point, right? It's an anchor, so then you can start getting on and planning for your life. But when you don't have a home, you're constantly moving around, it takes a lot of energy out of you. So, maybe you want to go finish your high school degree. Maybe you want to do this, but you just don't have the energy to do it because you're just so focused and stressed, the chronic stress of having a home over your head. And then think about the impact on kids as well. If you're kind of, in a precarious housing situation, and imagine the impact on kids. We don't see it right now, but we know that there is an impact future. So anyway, I know we'll get into it, but I agree with everything Mukhtar said as well. A home is so important, so fundamental. It's a right, I think, for all Canadians.
Absolutely. And I mean, both of you mentioned so many key pieces to that. Jeanhy, I like the idea of a key to the front door. And we talk about that with people who are in emergency or shelter. We say, this is not good enough for you. We want you to have a key to your front door, so it's yours, and it's that ownership. And Mukhtar, you mentioned dignity too, like the dignified housing. We have to get past the, hey, this is good enough, or this is just a roof and a door. It's really, is it dignified? Everyone deserves that dignified housing. Quite often we'll see that people will say, hey, here's a better sleeping bag or tent, that people can survive better outside. And think we're not looking for a better sleeping bag or a better tent. I always, the litmus test for that is usually I'll say, would you put your parent in it or your kids? And the answer is always no. So then say no, right? That's not it. But thank you both for that. We want to learn a little bit more about you both. Usually, I always go back to when you're in younger grades, below grade 6, people say, what do you want to be when you grow up? Usually where we're at now is not what we said, because we had no idea it even existed or the need for it was there. Can you talk a little bit about your journey into what you're doing now? And this time we'll reverse it. Mukhtar, we'll start with you, then go to Jeanhy.
Okay, this is going to be a lengthy answer. I've been at it for 30 years. So if you want to go back to my grade 6, it's a long journey, as you can tell from the gray hair. I guess in terms of my housing journey, it was I was a science student, got married, had a kid on the day of my finals. So we were quite. So we started off quite poor, penniless students with no home. So we ended up having to find housing. And actually were homeless as a family, and we were fortunate in the UK. You got councils that can provide housing, and this was back in the 80s. So we were fortunate enough to get council housing, and again that gave us the energy to be able to then improve our income and then look to find a way to access the housing market. So So in terms of in terms of my career, I trained as a scientist. I was a chemical. I did chemistry, so I was an analytical chemist for a little while. But science didn't pay too well, and I had a young family at that point. So ended up working for a realty firm, selling and renting homes on the market, which taught me a lot about how people make money out of housing. You have a lot of interesting characters in the industry, and there's ways that they make money, which is, it can be challenging at times. But I was fortunate. I was able to get a job in the Housing Association, late 80s, when we were just doing they were piloting the private sector leasing program. So this is where they were leasing properties on the market from landlords for 3-year term, because a lot of people who were going to councils ran out of housing, and they were having to house them in bed and breakfasts and temporary accommodation, which wasn't great, and didn't give any stability to the families, especially kids that were living in one room and having to be moved from place to place until they got some level of permanent housing. So these were 3-year leases which we leased from the market, from landlords, and the guarantee to the landlord was that they get their guaranteed rent, and any damage was covered by the association. So that allowed more properties to come to the market, because a lot of landlords were nervous about housing benefit tenants and the damage and the rent not being paid and everything else. So this gave them some certainty. So we pulled it in. And that was a pilot program which was really successful and has grown to now be a major provider of temporary accommodation across the UK. So I did that for a couple of years, and then moved into development for a number of housing associations in London and Southeast England. Eventually got to development director, and we were building, I was leading programs of at least building 1,000 homes a year for the societies that I was working with over the next 15, 20 years. Yeah, because then I went into work for the private sector as a management consultant at Savills, and that was working again in the affordable housing space. The idea was to work with a lot of the societies that didn't have development programs and development teams to support them through that process. But I joined Savills in 2008 when we had the financial crash, and basically everything stopped in terms of finances. And we then switched because there was no development going on in terms of a housing association. So we worked with government at that time to do feasibilities on all the projects that are stored in the private sector. The developers couldn't raise financing from the banks to finish off the project. So the government stepped in with loans to finish those projects off. So my role was working with the developers and the government to do the feasibilities, to do the risk assessments, and then flow the money through to finish the projects. And now we had lots of completed projects, but in a downturn, which nobody was buying. So it was an opportunity for government to look at the build to rent program and trying to encourage more institutional investment in housing, because a lot of the housing in the UK, the rental stock was owned by mum and pop, one or two properties that again was not great for long-term stability for tenants. And in the UK, I think we had 1% of the stock that was institutional housing, investment housing, and in Europe we had about 17%. So the longer term pension funds they're interested in a stable cash flow because they're matching their pension liabilities, and therefore what they were wanting to do is they're not interested in 10 units or 100 units. And in those days, we used to say they didn't get out of bed unless you had a 100 million project on the table for them. So we were talking about thousands of units being transferred over, and the government came up with initiatives to encourage that sector to invest in housing and get those units built. So that was a few years in terms of that. We also did do some international consultancy at that time, which was interesting because you go to some countries and you realize they don't have the infrastructure or the ecosystem that we have in the UK, because the UK has been fairly well established in terms of affordable housing, way before the Industrial Revolution, but even in the Industrial Revolution, you had all the factories, ball mills, the Cadburys, Guinnesses, all building houses for their workers, etc. And then you had a huge council building program after the Second World War. So there's been a lot of investment in housing and different iterations of the processes, from social housing to general needs housing, supported, affordable market housing, affordable home ownership to market sale. So we've gone through a lot of different iterations and tested out a lot of those models. And we've seen a lot more urbanization going on in other countries around the world, and those countries not having that infrastructure or the ecosystem to support housing in those communities. So we were advising governments internationally, and then I was fortunate enough to be approached for the job as the Chief Housing Officer at the City of Vancouver. So that's my connection to Canada. Came to Canada 11 years ago as a Chief Housing Officer, and that was looking at the community plans and addressing some of the housing challenges that we were seeing. And the role was to coordinate that across the city departments, because we had different departments looking at different aspects of housing policy, and this was to try and bring it together to try and see how we could become a bit more cohesive in terms of the approach that we were taking. Because what you find is generally is that you got different rules and regulations that conflict with each other, and that sort of hinders the process. So that was a big part of my job. And then also to set up the Vancouver Affordable Housing Agency, because the city of Vancouver bought a lot of land over the years, and there was an opportunity to utilize that and create more housing. So we were looking to build 2,500 homes on city land, but leveraging other partners, the province, non-profits, philanthropy, finding ways to get money into the system and get those homes built. And then again, those processes took time, 2.5, 3 years before you see permanent housing, and you can see that immediate need now. So we looked at the movable modular concept, and back in the 90s I was working on modern methods of construction in the UK, because we were switching from brick and block because we didn't have enough labour or skilled labour, and we were needing more housing supply. So we tried a whole load of different technologies. So bringing that learning to Canada and getting that modular housing built. We built that first project in 6 months. There were 250 square foot suites, self-contained. Built them for $3 million, $75,000 a unit. And it took 6 months from the time that we appointed the contractor to the time that people moved in. There were a lot of naysayers along the way, because people thought modular housing was trailer park trash and we can't have that in Vancouver and all that kind of stuff. So breaking that barrier, and we're fortunate that we had strong city manager and strong mayor wanting to make this happen. So you need the political will and the courage to be able to overcome some of those challenges that you have. But it was successful. And then when we had a change of government in BC, they built 2,000 of these units across the province. So there was a massive. What we see is that once you have a proof of concept, that you tend to get the delivery. But that being said, so my hope and was always to see how we could build affordable housing at scale. So we'll try to do that at the city, and then once I left the city, I've been working. Advocating for changes in the system, and then obviously met Jeanhy some years ago. We set up Crosswalk and looking to build affordable housing at scale using modular construction, being part of some of the disruption that we want to try and put out there, I guess, and see how we can look at things differently. The biggest challenge, we'll talk about this a little bit later, but the biggest challenge is that I've seen is that it's always difficult to get those first few steps, but once people can see the path, then more people tend to follow.
That's right. We're friendly disruptors with a smile.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, it's prove it, right? Prove it on a small scale. And when you call something a pilot, if it fails, it's just a pilot. And if it succeeds, great, you can scale it, right? So it's a safe way to move people forward, funders especially. Thank you for that. For such a young man, a long journey, but glad you shared that with us. Jeanhy, how about your foray into this work?
Yeah. Well, I also, like Mukhtar, have over 30 years of experience in real estate development. I come from it more from the private sector side, though, and then pivoting towards kind of more social housing or affordable housing. But I actually, so I guess if you go way, way back, so my parents immigrated to Canada in the late 60s from South Korea. My sister and I were born here. And obviously, when immigrants come, don't speak English, the usual story, right? It's about housing. I remember we were never without housing. My parents worked very hard and continued to work hard and as long as they could. And I remember they bought their first home in North. I grew up in North Etobicoke and Rexdale, and it was just a community full of similar immigrants, right? That's where they could afford to buy a home. So that's where I grew up. And I actually ended up studying. I went to McGill and the London School of Economics and thought I studied political science and economics and thought I'd work at the UN and be an ambassador. And I even applied to the Foreign Service. I got in. And anyway, when I graduated, though, it was the early 90s and it was the market crash. We were in recession. There were no jobs. So I actually fell into real estate. It was literally a job I replied to, a newspaper ad. I was living back with my parents in Mississauga in their home. They were in Mississauga by then. It was a 15-minute bike ride from my house to be an administrator for a condo project that had gone into receivership because the developers in the late 80s had built a bunch of condos without pre-sales. It was the boom times, but then obviously when the market crashed, these builders were left with projects with no units sold. So the receivers took over. So I just replied to an ad at that. When you graduated in the early 90s, you just had to take any job. Didn't really matter. You couldn't afford to be picky. So that's how I kind of fell into real estate. And I worked for two fabulous women who had started a company. It was on the brokerage side, and I loved being in the sales center. You're greeting people, you're touring them, you're doing everything except the selling, obviously, because you have to be a licensed agent. But that's where I got my taste of the real estate business. It was dynamic. It was you got to meet a lot of people. You got to do a lot of things. You did reports. You did a lot of stuff. Kind of my background, a lot of research and market research and reports and that sort of stuff. But then it was also very front facing. So it was a very exciting field. So I fell into it. And, I spent a couple of years. I went down to DC for a bit thinking I need to work in my field, apply to the Foreign Service, all of that stuff. But really loved real estate. And I got into the business when you see what happens when everything goes wrong, which is actually in today's time is actually quite interesting. People panicking who are younger than me and kind of, oh my God, the sky's falling. It's like, okay, this is kind of similar. But, I worked in-house with brokers. I worked in-house with developers. First half of my career and really understood. I'm not a real estate agent, so I've always been on the development side. It's about market research, it's about data, it's about understanding market opportunities, feasibility, product development, all of that stuff. So that's kind of where I kind of learned the business on the ground. Working in-house with developers is great. You learn the construction side, the financing side, the sales and marketing side, the dealing with the public. So really got that well-rounded kind of understanding of real estate development, so largely focused in the GTA. That's where I'm based, and working on condominium projects, luxury, entry level. And back then in the 90s and 2000s, we were actually selling to real people. So when you talk about home, it was so exciting to sell to people where it's their first home. A lot of first-time buyers. So it was quite an interesting time. Learned a lot. And then I remember, I think I was 39 and I was quite active in the Home Builders Association, went to one of their annual end of the year talks. I remember Peter Gilligan was the keynote speaker. And I remember Peter Gilligan is the founder and CEO of Mattamy Homes. I remember him talking about the responsibility to give back. And even though I was only 39, I was, at the stage of my career, I'd been working for, well over a decade, well over, 15 years, and thought, I'd never really been into charity work a lot. And that's when I started joining Peter's charity rides and starting doing other stuff and realizing that a lot of the skills that I had were transferable to address a lot of these issues facing society. I felt very privileged. We didn't grow up rich. We grew up as, working, immigrant family, but felt very privileged that to have a home and to have never been without a home. And realized that, I was kind of, and I'm a bit of an entrepreneur, so I was kind of itching to kind of like, there's, I can help. I don't know all the answers, but can my skills help? So I've always continued working in the private sector. Started working as a consultant because you still got to pay the bills, but really started thinking about and scheming all these other things, dreaming about, we need to build affordable housing, we need daycare, we need to fix our education system, we need to fix our health care system. So all of these other things, but really real estate related, obviously, was kind of my wheelhouse. So kind of in that past decade. And then I had a daughter at that time as well. So that kind of changes your perspective, right? We were a downtown condo family. I launched a pilot project, a children's museum pilot project in downtown Toronto in 2015, because the idea was you need child-friendly infrastructure in a city if you want families to raise kids downtown or in condos. That was kind of the thinking at the time. So, got excited and got involved in doing these projects, or passion projects, I guess, all the while still consulting, because like I said, still had to pay the bills, but really understood, and great network of people, and realized that, I could be a catalyst or contribute to, can we move the needle and help make things better? So when COVID hit, a lot of the private sector work that I was doing, the consulting, were dried up. So it became like, okay, maybe now's the time to start thinking about pivoting, and thought about, I always wanted to be a developer. I want to build affordable housing. And looking around the landscape, realized that, again, back to my original, sharing with you what I think the importance of home, and now having a daughter at that time as well, a young daughter, and we lived in a mixed income, mixed socioeconomic community, which I loved. My daughter we had $1 million condos. We also had people living in community housing. So my daughter and kind of the friend group that you make with parents, very, very mixed, and really got to see and understand kind of the struggles, and really, again, kind of encourage me even more to kind of start thinking about, like, let's set up this nonprofit affordable rental development company. So the name, something my daughter actually came up with. I think my daughter was 9 at the time, and we were on some long drive. It was during COVID, and I was telling her what Mommy wanted to do, and she said, what about Crosswalk Communities? Because we really wanted to focus on low-income working Canadians. So these aren't homeless individuals. These are people who are kind of, they have precarious shelter. They are working. They don't have mental health, drug, alcohol addiction supports that they need, but just low-income working Canadians. The ones during COVID we call, our essential workers and key workers, and we bang pots and pans for them. And I realized that, again, as I talked to earlier, just the stress of how do I pay rent, that how it impacts your life, everything in your life, right? So we decided we wanted to focus on that group. So my daughter came up with the name of Crosswalk, because she said, well, it's like, when the crosswalk is there to help you to go safely from one side to the other. So that's how we came up with the name Crosswalk Communities. Really, the idea is if we can provide stable, affordable housing for low-income working Canadian families, it's kind of like Crosswalk, right? It's helping them to kind of perhaps transition and have the energy to kind of look forward and plan for a better future for families and lives. So that's where Crosswalk really came about, is really thinking, okay, maybe now's the time to use my skills. If you think about affordable housing development, like 95% of it is the same as building, luxury condo buildings. If you think about it, the machinations, the hoops you have to jump through, the details are all the same, except affordable housing is like 1,000,000 times more difficult because you don't have money and you have to find the money. So during the early years, it was kind of during COVID, people were introducing each other to everyone, and I got introduced to Mukhtar. Got introduced to our other two co-founders, Toby Lennox and Patrick Shields. And it was interesting. We all kind of coalesced around our common desire to want to use our private sector experience, expertise, and knowledge, but to actually focus it now on how do we, get this, how do we build affordable rental housing for low-income working Canadians? I know I'm kind of straying into kind of perhaps later on in the podcast, but that's kind of my journey, I guess, in a nutshell. Some other things I've done, but really in a nutshell, it's pivoting. I realize I've always lived my life as you just need enough. Everyone's enough is different, but really it's how can I then, and I with my colleagues, use our knowledge and skills to try to contribute and to help address the issue of affordable housing. It's a huge issue. We're not going to solve it all ourselves, but we're committed to doing our little bit. And so that's kind of very in a nutshell, Michael, kind of my journey from political science, economics, international politics to working on city building. But really, city building it's about understanding people, and I always enjoyed listening and understanding and what can I do to contribute and to help make the city better, make people's lives better.
Well, and thanks for that, Jeanhy. I mean, and we want to talk more about Crosswalk Communities. You mentioned a piece in there. We're in a housing crisis, as most people are aware. If take a look at the news, any given day, it is top of mind for most Canadians, largely because we're in an affordability crisis as well right now. The private sector plays a huge role, always has, but so does the nonprofit sector. But there are challenges around that. I'm wondering if both of you can weigh in. Why is that? Why is it kind of stalled, and why does the nonprofit sector struggle to play a larger role in creating affordable housing?
Mukhtar, do you want to go first?
I'll kick off because we went through. I'm trying to understand this when I came to the city of Vancouver, having had the experience in the UK. And perhaps if I speak a little bit about that, because there is a similarity to a certain degree, and then there's been a divergence in terms of how we move forward differently in Canada as opposed to in the UK. So in the UK, similar to Canada, we had community groups, faith-based organisations that set up homes to address the needs in the community that government wasn't addressing back in the day. So 60s and 70s, you had a lot of faith-based organisations, community groups coming together, co-ops, wanting to support the community that they lived in. And they were sort of around the 60s and 70s. And then in the 80s, government wanted to diversify, because at that time, the majority of the house building was through councils for affordable housing. And they wanted to diversify and bring the housing, non-profit housing market, and they gave them 100% funding. So societies could go out, buy land, build the units, and government paid for all the soft hard costs and the land costs, so 100% funded. And what they told the societies is that the rental income would cover your operating funding. So as they were able to go out and grow the 100, 500,000, 2,000 units, once you get to a certain stage and you get a certain amount of revenue coming from the income on the rents, then your operating costs are covered and there's a surplus. So the government then said, we'll cut back that 100% funding to 80%, 70%, 60%. So in the 90s, that got reduced. And the societies had to adapt, because there was a big shock. They were used to getting 100% funding. So I remember the uproar when the government said they were going to cut the funding. They were thinking it was the end of the world, but they adapted over the years and became more efficient. There was amalgamation in the sector, because again, we had thousands of societies owning few units, and government from their side also wanted to rationalize that, because they wanted to be able to manage the sector better. And as they were cutting back on the funding, they also encouraged the societies to grow. And they were able to do this through partnerships as they moved into affordable home ownership, into market rent and market sale, to be able to then get the cost subsidies to help support the affordable housing program. So there was much more diversification in the product portfolios. But there were risks associated with that you've got a sector that's not used to the private side going into. So there were early mistakes made, or they were working in the same way as you would for someone who's got no choice to some degree, as opposed to the market where people have got a choice, and you charge, and you can lose millions of dollars and hundreds of thousands of dollars if you're not having your operations right. So there was a lot of collaboration with the private sector, a lot of learning through the 90s. And then the societies grew to 20,000, 30,000, 50,000, 100,000, because there was more amalgamation going on. And government enabled this through regulation. So there were 5 things that government wanted each society to be measured against, and that was governance. They wanted to ensure that there was good governance in the organization, good financial balance sheet, because they wanted to ensure that these societies were sustainable. Development program, because they wanted the societies to utilize their balance sheet to create more homes, because obviously there's a huge need that we were addressing. Strong tenant management and tenant input, because again, we wanted to make sure that the homes that were being built and managed actually met the needs of the tenants, and strong asset management strategy. Now, that again was a big rude awakening, because if societies didn't, there was independent audits, and if organizations weren't meeting those standards, they were given time to improve their performance, or they were merged with other societies. And the reason being is that governments gave an implicit guarantee to funders that they would support the sector, and therefore the sector could go and get cheap financing on the back of that implicit guarantee that government gave. And the funders also knew that there was regulation, so they had comfort that they were being regulated, that the balance sheets would be strong, the financing would be looked after, there'd be good governance, and there'd be strong asset management. So all of those factors played into the fact that societies could go and get cheap financing on the market as much as from government. And they were raising bonds and going, so you could get really cheap long-term financing, which helps support those programs over the longer term. When I came to Canada, I think I expected the same thing, to be fair, but it wasn't quite the same. It took me a while to understand how the system worked, but it looked like in the early days, CMHC provided mortgages as opposed to grants, so people had to pay back those loans over the 30 years. A lot of the land was on leased land that the municipalities provided, especially in Vancouver, and they had 40-year leases. So when I came to the city, those 40-year leases were coming to an end. So that had another pressure, because now people have aged in place and don't have the funds to either pay the taking on a new lease at a new market rent at that particular time. And there had not been a lot of regulation, so a lot of the assets hadn't been well maintained. So properties that had been anticipated to have paid off their mortgage now were well maintained assets, and therefore there was no mortgage to pay. You could still charge an affordable rent, needed a complete redevelopment or refurbishment, and therefore a new mortgage to be paid as well. So the sector itself has been challenged in that the fact there's not been enough capacity and financing available to build up their portfolios and the balance sheet so that they could grow. And then government stopped funding back in the 90s altogether. So basically what you find is that these societies built the one or two buildings, and that was it. And that's the thing that I found in Vancouver. We had 200 housing societies managing 25,000 units. And you're thinking that's a real difficulty from a city's perspective. You've got to administer 200 societies. That takes resource from yourself. And then on average, the societies had less than 100 units. And across BC, I think we've got, and I'll talk about BC because I'm based in Vancouver as opposed to Ontario, but we got 1,000 housing societies broadly managing 100,000 units. So less than 100 units each or less. Now, if you think about some of the societies having 1,000 units, then obviously there's a lot more that have a fewer units across the country. So if you just think about the overhead of managing a society and you've got 1,000 of them, a lot of the rent would go to just cover an overhead and not cover all the other costs that you need to do that. And what that means is that now you've got operating subsidies coming from BC Housing or CMHC to bridge the gap between what it costs to operate the building and maintain it, and the rents are relatively low because most people have lived there for a long time and seniors. So now you've got a lot of resources going into keeping the operations going as to opposed to creating more affordability or more affordable homes. And bear in mind, you've got scarce resources anyway. I think there's a real challenge in terms of understanding the ecosystem and where money's going and how we can make it more efficient. If you look at the National Housing Strategy, it didn't speak to the non-profit sector in terms of how to build up its capacity. It spoke about the RCFI, which is Rental Construction Finance Initiative in the main, and that was to support the private sector to build. And you can understand that government needed to take quick action. Developers have got the experience to build homes quickly, and that's where the money's gone. But that's fine for the short term as you kickstart the rental programs and build more of those as you move forward. But for the long term, you need a strong third sector that creates that affordable housing supply for those moderate incomes, those workforce housing, those people that are left out of the market. Because even with the market developers, even with the subsidy that they get from low-cost financing, you're still talking about 90% of market rents, and market rents are really high. You're not addressing the needs in the community, and that's why we've got this big challenge and a big pushback from every community at the moment when they're seeing developments going up, because they're saying, well, these aren't affordable to us, and we're not doing enough to build more affordable housing. So that's been part of what I've been and we've been working on, to see both Crosswalk is looking to build affordable housing at scale just to show that it's possible. Because one of the things that we also found was, because CMHC is stepping into the sector after a long time, and also because there's scarce resources, they will fund a project because they need to fund projects across Canada and make sure that everyone's getting a fair share of the resources, limited resources that there are. But it means that one project's funded here, there, and everywhere, as opposed to a program. I mean, the advantages that we had in the UK is that you were given a program of 1,000 units or 2,000 units or 5,000 units, and you gear up your development teams, you gear up your development processes, and you build those 5,000 units, and you learn from those, and you build them more efficiently as you grow in scale. If you're building a one project for the first time after 30 years, you've got a lot of learning to do, even if you bring specialists in. So you build in one project that's really expensive, and then you lose all that learning because you're never going to get your second project for the next 5 years anyway, because it takes that long to build it. So we're not maximizing the resources that we have currently on the existing stock to maintain the housing, and the new housing is built in a very piecemeal way, which doesn't actually encourage best use of those scarce resources that we have. So there's a lot of system and change that we need to enable that to happen. We are seeing organizations that are taking the risk, and the boards are stepping up and wanting to grow the organizations. But that will take time. But it does need much more of a intentional policy from funders like CMHC or the province or the municipalities to encourage those organizations that want to grow in a way that can be sustainable.
Well, I will, Mukhtar, I'll say this from a nonprofit that's just done it kind of for the first time, where we're taking down a small house, we're putting up 14 stack townhomes. In order to get shovel ready, which is sometimes what you need to qualify for funding, nonprofit spending $1 million, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Now, for an organization like Blue Door, that's only a $20 million organization, to go to the board to say, we're going to spend $1 million. Yeah. There's no guarantee that we'll get to build after that once we get to this. And one of the board's main responsibilities is to manage risk, right, for the organization. It's a big risk to take, and as nonprofits, and we're a mid-size, so smaller organizations that might have land that they can develop, we see them. They're just not willing to take the risks, or there's too much involved around rezoning, et cetera. So we see it day to day. Let's talk about where Crosswalk comes into this conversation. Jeanhy, you started us down that road of how it came about. Talk to me a little bit about what makes Crosswalk different, and what are your kind of goals and hopes for it?
Well, first and foremost, Crosswalk, we decided to incorporate as a nonprofit organization. So we're quite unique in that we're a development company with decades and decades of development expertise on the ground. We roll up our sleeves. We know how to get things built. But we decided to incorporate as a nonprofit entity for various reasons. First, it really helps with the balance sheet as well. But, so Crosswalk Communities, as I mentioned earlier, was set up really focused on how do we build affordable rental housing for kind of more moderate and low income Canadians. So to Mukhtar's point, and certainly these are my clients in the private sector world, private sector developers should and have a responsibility to contribute to building affordable housing. But the reality is they're building the affordable housing at more the upper end of the affordability scale, the housing spectrum. And really there's this kind of like missing teeth in the lower end. And we felt that we wanted to focus on that. So I touched on it a little bit earlier in terms of our motivation. And what makes us different is we sat down as a team and said, we're not doing this. It's not a bucket list thing. We don't want to get one project done and pat ourselves on the shoulder and say, we did it. It was really about system change. And Mukhtar was a big influence on how do we move the needle to enable us to build, and also to enable other nonprofits to build the affordable housing together with private players, with government, everyone else out there, because we really do need to address all the affordable housing needs all along the housing continuum. And two unique things about us. We decided to try to figure out a business model to achieve this that minimized reliance on government funding. because we know that governments now are challenged financially because not only to deal with the housing crisis, but there's health, there's an aging population, there's a myriad of other demands on government coffers. But as much as housing is important, we're competing with everyone else. We wanted to figure out, how do we come up with a sustainable, replicable business model that minimizes or perhaps eliminates, if we can, reliance on government funding. Our second, and the way we address that is we realize that there's been, especially in the past several years, a growing interest from non-government investors, so social impact investors, foundations, charities, philanthropists, communities. We've seen an interest in contributing financially to getting affordable housing built, but we also know the people aren't going to write a check to the government, and they're not going to write a check to CMHC. So we wanted to come up with a vehicle, a financing vehicle that's transparent, with good governance, through which perhaps non-government investors can invest directly and have their funds have a direct impact on getting affordable housing built. So that was something that differentiates Crosswalk Communities. We spent years talking to dozens and dozens of people and trying to understand the opportunities, the risk tolerances, and we've come up with what we believe is a business model that we're looking to now take forward into a pilot project to see if we can find those early adopters who will invest, who will in a specific project in a community. And then the other thing that differentiates us is speed. We've decided to adapt using volumetric modular construction. So these modern methods of construction that Mukhtar in particular came to our team with lots of experience with, because speed is important. These big high-rise towers take never mind the approval process, but to get them physically built takes a long time. Meanwhile, every day that passes, people are living in precarious housing or in shelters or not housed at all. So we understood that using volumetric modular construction in particular, or any type of modular or offsite construction method, can speed up the timeline as well. So that's an integral part of our business model as well, to be able to deliver, low to mid-rise multifamily apartment buildings in small and large communities across the country, and we can do it within 12 months from building permit to occupancy. So that was an important part of our business model as well. But we're quite excited about, having created this financial platform, and because we're a nonprofit, everything's completely transparent. We've got, the proper governance, we've got the transparency, but to Mukhtar's earlier point, we're still facing the same challenges that every other, developer faces. Even if you're a private sector developer, is, our pro formas look good, we can go to the banks, but it still comes down to, well, where's your financial covenant? And never mind, even to get to that point, we have to somehow find the pre-development money to be able to, hire the consultants to put together the development applications. And to your point, Michael, there's no guarantee that you're going to get approved. So, there's a lot more challenges and obstacles facing nonprofits. And we also do, as Crosswalk Communities, we also do development management work for other nonprofit groups. Recognize that most nonprofit groups are not developers, that they're faith groups, they're community groups. They have land perhaps and a desire and a shared common values and desire to build some sort of affordable housing. So we do development management work for other nonprofit groups as well, because we have that expertise and understand the process and the challenges and the risks and everything. But even for our clients who are nonprofits, it's the same challenge at the end of the day, is how do you get that financing? So, Mukhtar's example of what they did in the UK with the government playing a role of not cutting a check, but providing that implicit guarantee, which unlocked, financing opportunities as well. So we're hopeful that with our new business model and development model, that we can show that there is a way for, non-government stakeholders to participate. And from our discussions we've had, Michael, there is a lot of will out there. There's a lot of awareness and a lot of desire to help contribute to getting affordable housing built. So, but with Crosswalk is, we're not a fund though. When we're looking for social impact investors, it'll be on specific projects. So we have in our business model, if you invest, you have a direct line of sight to where your money's going. It's going to a specific project, perhaps in your community or elsewhere. So,
talk to me more about that. I'm interested in the business model, right? And for listeners, if you're listening, and people are saying, okay, we want to be that pilot project and we want to reach out. That's the business. But you talk about investing, right? So often people will say, hey, how about community bonds? And say, well, that's short term, because you're going to borrow that money and you have to give that back plus some, right? So it's not funding, it's funding for the time being. talk to me a little bit about your model. And when you talk about investing, why would people want to invest? How does it work? How is it different?
Mukhtar, did you want to jump into that, or shall I?
You go first.
Okay. Yeah. So the way we've structured is when we have people investing, they're really kind of it's a collaborative approach that as an investor, you're providing the capital that's needed to get a project built. So Crosswalk Communities, we have the expertise and the knowledge and the experience to be able to kind of mitigate risk, anticipate, and to kind of manage the process, and then also to operate the buildings afterwards. But what we lack is the capital. So we're looking for really investors as partners to come alongside us, provide that capital, perhaps for land acquisition. If it's municipalities, it could be even providing land on a 99-year land lease basis. There's a lot of flexible ways to acquire land, but then also providing the capital needed as part of your development equity to be able to then go to a bank to access that financing. So being partners, we build into our pro formas a return. Because one thing we've learned in all the listening we've done and speaking to dozens and dozens of stakeholders of different types is that, unless they're being philanthropic, that there is an expectation of a return. So we do build into our pro formas a social rate of return, which we've learned is anywhere from kind of 3 to 6%. So we build that into our pro forma from the beginning. And as impact investors, then you are kind of, you're in the project for the long run because you've acquired the land, you've provided the money to get the building built. And so you stay in the project alongside Crosswalk Communities, us as the development, people with the development expertise and also in operating the buildings. So we recognize that, if we have social impact investors, you have to still manage their risk. It's not enough to say, hey, we're good people, you can trust us, we're going to do good, that it's still an investment, even if it is a social investment. But we're encouraged that there are people out there who are interested and wanting, comfortable with taking a lower rate of return, still have to have all your T's crossed and your I's dotted and everything still has to, be properly structured, but they're willing to do that for the other double benefit of having low income, working Canadians be able to live in our homes and pay a rent that is based on their actual income and not, 80 or 90% of median market rent.
So the ownership model, if I understand what you're saying, is so investors might have they have kind of skin in the game because they're an owner. Crosswalks would be an owner. Is the nonprofit then? Are they the operator? Outside of that,
Crosswalk Communities as the nonprofit is the developer. We actually we have that experience. We got the project entitled, we got it built, and we also operate. So because what we've also learned is that there's a lot of individuals who want to contribute to affordable housing, but then they kind of get scared off on the thinking of about how do you operate it. Some people have these crazy misconceptions about, renting to, kind of low income earners, that sort of thing. So we really kind of, de-risk the project in that way as well, saying, we also operate the buildings moving forward. And we work with community partners on the ground as well. Maybe Mukhtar, you can elaborate on that.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say, in addition to that, there's different models because we see that there's no one size fits all kind of approach, especially as we've been reaching out to people and different communities have different needs as well. So one model is, as Jeanhy's described, where we develop, operate the building. There's others where we work with partners that bring land. That could be a private developer or a non-profit that invests the land into the partnership, and therefore that lowers our costs up front. And it could be another one where we do the development as a development agent and somebody else takes the ownership and the operating model going forwards as well. But one of the things that we're finding, especially if you're looking, different layers of investment as well. There's some investors that are happy to look at small projects, but many of them are looking at scale as well. So I think that's one of the challenges that we're facing is that we've got to go out there and do a pilot, as we've said before, so that people can see that the concept works. But the intent is to then build 5-10 projects. And I think one of the examples from the UK, and something that we did here in Vancouver as well, was the fact that when investors are looking for larger scale projects, you look to bring together a consortium of partners that have got the land that we can then present a portfolio of 100, 200, 500 units. When I came to Vancouver, we were setting up the Community Land Trust in Vancouver, and we had the BC Co-op Federation that was taking the lead on that. We worked with them at that point to transfer 4 parcels. Initially, they were talking about 4 different societies managing each parcel, but we wanted to get scale, so we had one organization taking all 4 parcels, and they then were managing all the back office stuff. So we had the efficiencies in the operations management, and the societies had specific mandates for seniors or different community groups. So they provided the programming element to it, and the back office stuff was coordinated, and we were able to cross subsidize the programs because there was one site that was more market orientated, so the surpluses from that were used to then support the more affordable units as well. And the Co-op Federation has used that now to expand the model to bring smaller co-ops into that kind of framework, because it is an ideal model to bring, like you said earlier, Michael, in terms of there's lots of non-profits that don't have the development capacity or ability, but they could be coming into a land trust model where they put their land into the project, and then you've got one organization doing all the back office, the asset management, and those societies then look after the tenants based on their mandate for why they were set up in the first place. So there's ways to work collaboratively together and leverage those resources. And what we're seeing generally is that government does want to come on side, but it's difficult. Unless you showcase what's possible, it's hard to get them excited. And as we move forward, CMHC have already started their preferred development program, so they are looking to get people doing programs as opposed to individual projects. So that's the transition that you will see in Canada, that over time there'll be less and less developing organizations, but potentially how do you work that process through in terms of ensuring that the mandates of those organizations is fulfilled in the long term as well. So I think there's a lot of exciting work to be done in terms of bringing people together and trying to meet the needs of those communities, and put aside some of the structural pieces that have come through from the past. And we went through that painful exercise. It's tough when you've had an organization you set up 30, 40, 50 years ago, and you got a board and a CEO that have been committed to sustaining that. It's hard to let go. So it's one of those things that we have to look at going forwards.
Hard to let go, but also, hey, maybe it's time for change. Let's be honest. I mean, we got to take some big swings here, folks. We're in a crisis, right? Like we've got to do. And I'll tell you that I'm sitting around some of those tables where people are pointing fingers, and where they should be pointing is right here back at, and I pointed at myself. I can't sit here and criticize government if I'm not looking at every piece of land Pluto owns. What can we be doing more of? What part do we play in answering this crisis? Crosswalk certainly is now providing a unique opportunity for groups around raising that capital, helping. Basically, what I see you're doing is you're overcoming all the barriers that are put before nonprofits are getting housing built, and you're flexible, Mukhtar, as you just mentioned too, around the different models that are out there, depending on what you bring to the table. Let's talk a little bit. What are your hopes for the future for Crosswalk Communities? Like, what do the next couple of years look like?
Well, right now we are actively looking for land and focused in the Greater Toronto Hamilton area to start. We have a couple of offers in, actually, because what we've learned now is that like I said, we've talked to dozens and dozens of people, and now what we need to have is an actual real project with real numbers, so we can go to people and find out who are those early adopters, so we can prove the model. And our hope and the whole purpose of doing this is we believe that if we can prove the model, when you talk to potential investors, there's a small group of early adopters, and then there's those people who will come in next, right? Second or third. So that's a much bigger group. So by doing this pilot project, we believe that it will enable us to then kind of, think bigger, think broader. Our goal is to build crosswalk communities, apartment buildings in small and large, medium-sized communities across Canada, and or also work with existing nonprofit groups in their communities to get housing built. We're executors. We just want to get stuff done. And, to what you mentioned, Michael, we've come up with a solution. We've had to kind of MacGyver a solution around kind of the current systemic challenges. We're also working in the background. Hopefully we can change the system in the long run. But in the meantime, we can't wait. We just need to get building. So we're open, we're flexible, and our goal really is to help and contribute to getting affordable housing built across the country, because small communities need them as urgently as large communities as well. So that's, I don't know, Mukhtar, what's your goal and hope?
No, well, hopefully it's the same because we're working together. So.
and
Did I miss anything?
For your Gen Z millennials, that MacGyver reference, you'll have to Google that up. And that is finding a way with, whatever it takes, gum and a popsicle stick to make things, to make things happen. It's a good reference, by the way. Listen, I think there'll be a lot of nonprofits taking you up on this, and I think you're right. We got to get kind of like Mukhtar, you said this earlier. Like, you got to prove the model, right? Let's prove it. Wow, okay, and then people pile on board. If people are interested in reaching out, want to learn more, if they want to partner or have conversations, where do they go?
We do have a kind of a homepage right now. We've been so focused, and all our energies focused on getting the company up and running, that we haven't built out an elaborate website. But if you can go to crosswalkcommunities.com, drop an email or give us a ring. And or you can look us up on LinkedIn. We're both pretty easy to find, but we'd love to talk to anyone out there who also wants to roll up their sleeves, and let's just figure it out. And we just got to get going. And we believe we've got that expertise and the desire to make it happen. We just don't have the money. So it's finding those partnerships to be able to make it happen. But
you've got the model to make that happen, which is super cool.
We do, yeah.
Yeah. And I think, I will be one of those people reaching out because I've got some ideas. I think, the timing of what you're doing is fantastic. I think, with some newer announcements, there's a number of municipalities too that have accelerator funds that are like, all right, we have these funds, we have a plan. How do we put it into action? Yeah. So I think you're part of that answer there. So thank you. I mean, you both really embody the whole thing around, if it's going to be, it's up to me. You step forward. You're trying to be part of the solution instead of, being okay with being part of the problem. And that is incredible. Thank you for what you do at Crosswalks. And I hope and I know that this is going to be an important part of the solution into the future. And thanks for taking the time out to join us today on the podcast.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Michael.
Take care.
Look forward to working with you.